The blade was an inch from my throat when the music stopped. I did not see it coming. Nobody in that hall of glass and silver light expected a killer to step out from behind the throne during my own wedding. One moment I was standing beside Issere, the crown of the veiled dominion resting on her head like a second sun, and the next moment a robed figure lunged from the shadows behind the altar, a curved weapon flashing toward my neck. I moved on instinct, not training. I grabbed the attacker's wrist, twisted hard, and drove my shoulder into his chest. We went down together, the crowd screaming in a language I had only begun to learn. Guards swarmed a heartbeat later, dragging the man away, but for that one moment, the entire court of the Veiled Dominion had seen a human fight for his own life in front of their princess, on the day he was supposed to be nothing more than a symbol. Issere did not scream. She did not even flinch. She looked down at me with those pale violet eyes, cold as frozen glass, and said only one word: useful. That was the beginning of my marriage. My name is Ethan Cole, and 3 years before that wedding, I was a soldier on a dying world. Earth had just made first contact with a galaxy far larger and far crueler than anyone had imagined. We were not explorers stepping proudly into the stars. We were a struggling species discovered by accident, weighed, measured, and found barely worth noticing. Dozens of empires had already claimed the stars around us. Compared to them, humanity was young, disorganized, and dangerously exposed. The Veiled Dominion was the largest power near our region of space, a civilization of tall, sharp-featured beings who valued strength, bloodlines, and control above almost everything else. When their scouts found Earth, there were 2 paths laid out for us. One path was conquest, the other was alliance, sealed the only way the Veil understood loyalty, through marriage between royal blood and a chosen representative of the lesser species. I was chosen because I was expendable in the eyes of my own government, and yet visible enough to matter. I had fought in the border skirmishes that followed first contact. I had survived situations that killed better-trained men. Someone in a quiet room decided that if humanity had to offer up a husband to save itself from being erased, it might as well be someone who already knew how to survive. Nobody asked if I wanted to marry a stranger from another world to save my planet. They simply told me it was happening, and I said yes, because the alternative was watching my home burn. Issere did not want me either. She was the heir to a throne built on centuries of pride, and to her, marrying a human was worse than an insult. It was closer to punishment. The first time we spoke, before the wedding, she looked at me the way someone looks at an animal that has been trained to walk on 2 legs. "You will learn our language," she told me. "You will learn our customs. You will not embarrass my family." I remember thinking that I had signed up to save my planet, not to be lectured by a woman who had never once had to fight for anything in her life. But I kept my mouth shut, because I understood something she did not yet understand about me. I was not there to be liked. I was there to survive long enough to matter. The wedding itself was a political performance, nothing more. The court of the Veiled Dominion filled that glass hall not to celebrate love, but to witness the collar being placed on humanity's neck. I heard the whispers in their language before I understood most of the words, but I understood the tone. Laughter disguised as respect, mockery disguised as tradition. They called me the human pet before the ceremony even began, and some of them said it loud enough for me to hear on purpose. I stood there in a borrowed uniform that did not fit right, surrounded by beings twice my height in some cases, and I told myself the same thing I had told myself in every dangerous moment of my life. Endure it, outlast it, do not give them the satisfaction of seeing you break. Then the assassin came, and everything changed in the space of a few seconds. After the guards dragged the attacker away, the hall fell into a strange, heavy silence. Blood was on my hands, not mine, and my formal jacket was torn at the shoulder. Issere stood over me, her expression unreadable, while dozens of nobles stared, waiting to see what she would do. She reached down and offered her hand. It was such a small gesture. On Earth, it would have meant nothing at all, but in that hall, in front of every noble family that had come to watch humanity be humiliated, the crown princess of the Veiled Dominion chose to help her human husband to his feet instead of stepping over him. I took her hand. It was cool to the touch, steady, and stronger than I expected. The ceremony continued, as if nothing had happened, because that was their way. Weakness was never acknowledged in public. But something had shifted in the air, and I could feel it, even though I barely understood their customs yet. A few of the younger nobles were not laughing anymore. A few of the guards who had mocked me before the ceremony were watching me differently now, the way soldiers watch someone who has proven he will not run. That night, after the feast and the endless ceremonies, Isire and I were finally alone in the quarters assigned to us. It was the first time since I had arrived that nobody was watching us, judging us, or measuring my every move against some ancient standard of worthiness. She stood by the tall window overlooking the capital city, her back to me, silent for a long time. "Why did you fight?" she finally asked. "You could have let the guards handle it. You could have simply stepped back and let their weapons do the work, as any sensible creature would." I told her the truth. Where I come from, standing still while someone tries to kill you is not considered sensible, it is considered dying. She turned to look at me then, and for the first time, there was something other than contempt in her eyes. It was not warmth, it was not respect, not yet. It was curiosity, sharp and unwelcome, like she had just discovered a piece on the board that did not move the way she expected. "You are not what I was told humans would be," she said quietly. I did not know what she had been told, and honestly, I did not care. I had spent my whole life being underestimated, first by people on my own world who thought a soldier from nowhere important could never rise above his station, and now by an empire that thought my entire species was barely worth the effort of conquering. I was used to being misjudged. What I was not used to was someone admitting it out loud. I told her plainly that I had not come there to be what anyone expected. I had come there because my planet needed someone willing to stand in a room full of people who wanted him dead and refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him afraid. She studied me for a long moment, then turned back to the window without another word. That was enough for one night. I did not expect friendship. I did not expect trust. All I had earned was a single crack in the wall she had built around herself, and in a marriage built entirely on politics and survival, a single crack was more than I had dared to hope for. I lay awake long after she fell silent, staring at an alien ceiling in an alien palace, thinking about home, about the family I had left behind, about the strange twist of fate that had turned a soldier into a husband to a princess who despised the idea of me. I did not know yet that the woman standing at that window would one day fight beside me against threats that could erase entire star systems. I did not know that the marriage forced upon both of us to buy a few more years of peace would eventually rewrite the balance of power across the galaxy. All I knew, on that first night, was that I had survived the wedding. I did not yet understand that surviving was only the beginning. Outside the window, the alien city glittered under 3 moons, indifferent to the two of us, and the fragile future we had just been forced to share. Somewhere far beyond that skyline, in the deep dark between stars, other powers were already watching the human who had refused to die quietly at his own wedding and taking notes. I closed my eyes that night not knowing if I would wake to another attempt on my life, another round of mockery from the court, or something else entirely. What I did know was that the woman across the room, cold and proud and utterly unreadable, had looked at me and seen something worth remembering. For a marriage built on nothing but necessity, that felt like more than I had any right to expect. It would take years before either of us understood just how much that single moment would matter. The first attempt on my life at the wedding was not the last, and I learned quickly that surviving one attack meant nothing if I could not survive the 100 quieter ones that followed. The Vale Court did not fight with blades in the open after that first night. They fought with words, with poison hidden in flattery, with rules I did not yet understand, twisted just enough to make me stumble in public. I spent my first year in that palace, learning their language not from books, but from mistakes. I mispronounced a greeting once, in front of a visiting delegation, and was nearly laughed out of the hall. I misunderstood a gesture of respect, and accidentally insulted an elder of one of the oldest families in the Dominion. Every mistake was noticed. Every mistake was reported back to Isire, usually with exaggeration, usually meant to embarrass her for choosing to help me stand at that first ceremony. She never apologized for my failures, and she never defended me in those early months. She simply watched, distant and unreadable, while I clawed my way through a culture built to break outsiders. I decided early on that I would not survive by trying to become one of them. I would survive by being exactly what I was, a human who did not quit, and letting that be enough. There was a soldier among the palace guard named Nathan Pierce, one of the few humans stationed there as part of the small diplomatic detachment sent to support me. He became something close to a friend in those first difficult months, the only person I could speak to freely, without worrying that every word would be reported to some noble family looking for a weakness to exploit. Nathan used to tell me that the Veil respected two things above all else: strength and usefulness, and that if I could not offer them warmth, I could at least offer them results. He was right. I stopped trying to charm the court and started proving my value instead. When trade negotiations stalled over a technical dispute neither side could resolve, I spent 3 sleepless nights studying human logistics manuals and found a compromise that satisfied both sides. When a group of Veil nobles tried to humiliate me during a hunting ceremony meant to test physical endurance, I outlasted every one of them, not because I was stronger, but because humans are stubborn in ways they had never encountered before. Isire began to notice. It started with small things. She would ask my opinion on a matter of trade before consulting her own advisors, not because she trusted me yet, but because she had learned my answers were usually practical when everyone else around her offered only tradition. She began correcting my grammar herself instead of letting the court mock me for it. Once, during a formal dinner, a visiting noble made a cruel joke about human intelligence, comparing us to livestock that had learned to walk upright. The whole table laughed, the way courts always laugh at cruelty dressed up as wit. Isire did not laugh. She looked at the noble with an expression I had only seen her use on enemies, and said, in a voice cold enough to silence the entire hall, that livestock did not negotiate trade agreements that saved the Dominion 3 cycles of resource shortages, and perhaps he should choose his comparisons more carefully in the future. The table went silent. The noble did not speak again for the rest of the meal. That night, I asked her why she had defended me. She told me it was not for my sake. It was because an insult to her husband, however unwanted the marriage had been, was an insult to her own judgment, and she would not tolerate her judgment being questioned by lesser nobles who had never risked anything in their entire comfortable lives. I did not believe her, not fully. I had learned by then that Isire rarely said what she actually meant, especially when it came to anything resembling feeling. Over the following 2 years, the marriage that had begun as a cage slowly became something else. We were never affectionate in the way humans understand affection. There were no soft words, no easy laughter between us in the beginning. What we built instead was something more like the trust between soldiers who have survived the same battlefield. I learned to read the small shifts in her expression that told me when danger was near before her guards even reacted. She learned to trust my instincts in situations where her own culture's rules left her unsure how to respond. There was a night, almost 2 years into the marriage, when an assassination attempt nearly succeeded where the first one had failed. We were traveling to a border settlement to review defenses against raiders from a rival system, and our transport was ambushed on a narrow mountain pass. The attackers were not amateurs like the man at the wedding. They were trained, coordinated, and clearly funded by someone with resources inside the Dominion itself. I remember the transport rocking violently as weapons fire tore through the outer hull. Nathan went down early, wounded but alive, and I dragged him behind cover while Isire's personal guards fought to hold the attackers back. It quickly became clear the guards were outnumbered. Isire's people fought with precision and discipline, trained for generations in the art of formal combat, but the attackers were not playing by formal rules. and I realized quickly that the Veil soldiers were dying because they kept trying to fight an honorable battle against enemies who had no intention of fighting honorably. I did something that would have been unthinkable in Veil military doctrine. I told the guards to break formation, to stop fighting as one disciplined unit, and scatter into the rocks, forcing the attackers to divide their forces instead of concentrating fire on a single defensive line. It went against everything they had been trained to do, and for a moment I thought they would refuse to listen to a human giving orders during a crisis. Isire gave the order instead, translating my strategy into a command her soldiers would obey. It worked. The attackers, expecting a disciplined formation to break easily under sustained pressure, found themselves suddenly facing scattered resistance from every direction. Within minutes, reinforcements arrived from the settlement ahead, and the ambush collapsed. Afterward, sitting in the wreckage of the transport with blood on my hands for the second time in that marriage, Isire asked me how I had known that strategy would work. I told her the truth. Humans had spent our entire history fighting wars against enemies stronger and better equipped than ourselves. We had learned a long time ago that rigid tradition loses to flexible thinking when the stakes are survival itself. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said something I had never expected to hear from her. Perhaps humanity is not the lesser species my people believed you to be. Perhaps you are simply a species my people never bothered to understand. It was not a declaration of love. It was not even close. But it was the first time she had spoken of humanity, and of me, as something worth genuine respect instead of tolerance. The rumors began not long after that ambush, whispers among the Dominion's advisors and scholars about something stirring beyond the outer territories, in regions of space the Veil themselves avoided. Nathan, who had connections among the diplomatic staff, brought me fragments of reports that spoke of entire settlements going silent without explanation, of scout ships that never returned, of a growing shadow that even the proud and powerful Veil Dominion seemed reluctant to discuss openly. Isire's own advisors called it old fear, ancient stories meant to frighten children into obedience. But I noticed that whenever the subject came up in formal council, even the most confident nobles grew quiet, and Isire's father, the reigning monarch, would change the subject with unusual speed for a man who otherwise enjoyed few things more than the sound of his own authority. I did not understand yet what that shadow was, or how deeply it would eventually reach into both our lives. All I understood was that something out there frightened an empire that feared almost nothing, and that whatever it was patient enough to wait. In the meantime, life inside the palace continued to change in smaller, quieter ways. Isire began inviting me to sit in on council sessions that had once been closed entirely to outsiders. She began teaching me, in private, the deeper history of her people, not the polished version given to foreign dignitaries, but the messy, complicated truth behind centuries of conquest and pride. In exchange, I taught her about Earth, about a species that had nearly destroyed itself more than once through war, yet had always found a way to rebuild, to adapt, to survive against odds that should have ended us. She found that fascinating in a way I had not expected. The Veil valued strength that came from bloodline and tradition. Humanity's strength came from something else entirely, from the refusal to accept defeat as final, and she began to see that difference not as weakness, but as a kind of resilience her own people had never needed to develop. There was a moment, nearly 3 years into the marriage, sitting together on a balcony, overlooking the palace gardens under the light of the smallest moon, when she admitted something quietly that she would never have said in front of her court. "I did not want this marriage," she said. "I resented you for existing, for being forced into my life, as though I had no say in my own future. I still do not know if what we have become is something I chose, or something circumstance built without asking either of us." I told her that I understood completely, because I had felt the exact same way on the day of the wedding. "But somewhere in these years," she continued, "I stopped seeing a burden standing beside me at council meetings, and I started seeing someone I trust more than anyone else in this palace, human or otherwise." I did not have a clever response to that. I simply told her that I felt the same, and for once, In a relationship built entirely on necessity and survival, that felt like the truth, rather than a diplomatic answer. Neither of us knew yet how soon that trust would be tested, in ways far more dangerous than court politics or mountain ambushes. Neither of us knew that the shadow the nobles refused to discuss was already moving closer, or that the next crisis would not come from a hidden assassin or a jealous noble family, but from someone far closer to the throne than either of us had ever suspected. For now, though, sitting under that small moon with a woman who had once called me useful and nothing more, I allowed myself, for the first time since arriving on that world, to believe that this strange, forced marriage might become something worth protecting, rather than simply something worth surviving. The alarms tore through the palace at the hour when the capital was supposed to be at its quietest. I woke to Issere already on her feet, pulling on armor she had not worn since the mountain ambush years earlier, her face lit by the red glow of emergency lighting spilling through the windows. Outside, the sky over the capital was burning. Streaks of falling debris cut through the clouds, and somewhere in the distance, the low groan of the planetary shield generators struggled against something trying to force its way through. "We are under attack," she said, and there was no fear in her voice, only the sharp focus of someone whose entire life had prepared her for a moment like this. What followed was the longest night of my life. The attackers were not raiders or rival nobles looking to make a political statement. They were something organized on a scale the Dominion had not faced in generations, striking multiple points across the capital at once, disabling communication towers, targeting the palace's outer defenses with a precision that suggested detailed knowledge of the city's layout, knowledge that should not have existed outside the palace walls. Issire's father gathered his commanders in the war room while I stood at the edge of the chamber, still considered by many of them an outsider despite the years I had spent proving otherwise. The reports came in fast and grim. Entire districts losing power, emergency channels jammed, a strike force moving directly toward the palace itself, cutting through defenses that should have held for hours instead of collapsing in minutes. It was Nathan, breathless and pale, who brought the piece of information that changed everything. He had intercepted a fragment of communication traffic, garbled but unmistakable, confirming that the attackers were using access codes reserved for the highest levels of the Dominion's own military command. Someone inside the palace had given them the keys. The room went cold. Issire's father demanded to know who among his most trusted commanders could have committed such a betrayal, and it was Issire herself, staring at a display of troop movements with a growing horror I had never seen on her face before, who spoke the name none of us wanted to hear. Her brother, Kaelor. I had never fully trusted Kaelor. He had always treated my presence in the palace with a kind of patient, simmering resentment that he hid well behind polite conversation and careful smiles. He was Issire's younger brother, ambitious in the way that second children of powerful families often become when they realize the throne will never be theirs by birthright alone. I had assumed his resentment was aimed at me, a symbol of an alliance he disagreed with. I had never imagined it ran deep enough for this. There was no time to process the betrayal fully. The strike force was closing on the palace, and the shield generators were failing faster than the engineers could repair them. Issire's father ordered a full evacuation of the royal family to the deep bunkers beneath the palace, a plan built for exactly this kind of catastrophe. It was a plan built on veiled assumptions, and it was going to get everyone killed. I told the war room bluntly that retreating into a fixed underground position against an enemy who clearly had inside knowledge of the palace's defenses was exactly what the attackers wanted. If Kaelor had given them the access codes, there was no reason to believe he had not also given them the layout of the bunkers themselves. The commanders bristled at a human questioning royal strategy in the middle of a crisis, but Issire silenced them with a single sharp word and told me to speak. I laid out a different plan, drawing on tactics that would have sounded absurd in formal Vale military doctrine, but made perfect sense to a species that had spent its entire history fighting wars of ambush and adaptation. Instead of one large evacuation to a single known location, We would split the royal family and key personnel into small, unpredictable groups, moving through service corridors never listed on any official palace schematic. Corridors I knew about only because Nathan and I had explored them years earlier out of simple curiosity during the long, quiet months of learning the palace's layout. It was reckless. It went against everything the Veil had been trained to trust, but it was unpredictable in a way that no leaked schematic could account for, and unpredictability was the only advantage we had left. Isire's father hesitated only a moment before giving the order. He had learned, over the years, to trust his daughter's judgment, and his daughter had learned to trust mine. What followed was chaos, but it was chaos we controlled instead of chaos that controlled us. I led one group personally, Isire leading another, moving through narrow maintenance corridors, while the sounds of fighting echoed through the walls above us. Twice we nearly ran directly into enemy patrols, and twice we avoided them only because the attackers, following stolen schematics, had no idea these particular passages existed. The confrontation with Kalor happened almost by accident, in a service tunnel beneath the eastern wing, when his own escape route crossed paths with ours. He stood there in the dim emergency lighting, flanked by two of his personal guards, and for a moment nobody moved. I watched something break behind Isire's eyes. Grief and fury tangled together in a way I had never seen from her before. "Why?" she asked him, her voice barely above a whisper. Kalor's answer was bitter and rehearsed, the words of a man who had spent years convincing himself he was in the right. He spoke of a dominion weakened by an alliance with a lesser species, of a throne that should never have bent to fear of a war that could have been won through strength instead of compromise, of his belief that he could rebuild the dominion into something purer once the current leadership, including his own sister, was removed and a new order installed in its place, an order that would deal with the shadow beyond the borders through conquest rather than what he called cowardly diplomacy. He believed the attackers he had led into the capital were only a tool, one he could control and discard once his goals were achieved. I could have told him how wrong that assumption would eventually prove to be, but there was no time for that conversation. His guards moved first, and the tunnel erupted into close, brutal combat in a space too narrow for any of the Dominion's formal fighting styles to matter. I do not remember every detail of what happened in those next few minutes. I remember Isire fighting with a controlled fury I had never seen from her, years of restrained grief and anger finally given a target. I remember pulling one of Kalor's guards away from her at the last possible second, taking a wound across my arm that would leave a scar I still carry. I remember Kalor himself, cornered and desperate, finally understanding that the sister he had underestimated for years was not going to be removed from the throne without a fight. In the end, it was not violence that stopped him. It was Isire herself, standing over her brother with every advantage in her hands, choosing to have him taken alive instead of ending things in that tunnel. She told him, in a voice colder than anything I had heard from her before, that he would face judgment in front of the same court he had tried to burn down around her, and that he would live long enough to understand exactly what he had thrown away. The attack on the capital was broken within hours once the stolen access codes were revoked and the shield generators came back online under new authorization. The strike force, cut off from the inside support that had made their assault possible, retreated in disarray. The following morning, standing in the ruins of the eastern courtyard with smoke still rising over parts of the capital, Isire's father addressed what remained of the gathered court and commanders. He spoke of betrayal, of the cost of pride, and then, in front of every noble family who had once mocked me as nothing more than a human pet, he named me consort regent of the Dominion, a title that placed me not beside the throne as a symbol, but within its formal chain of command as a leader in my own right. It was Isire who requested the title be given, not out of obligation, but because, as she told her father plainly in front of the entire court, the plan that saved their lives that night had not come from tradition or bloodline. It had come from a human mind, trained by a history of survival her people had never needed to develop, and she would not stand by while pride denied that truth any longer. Word of that night spread far beyond the borders of the Dominion within weeks. Other powers across the region, species who had watched humanity's alliance with the Veil with quiet skepticism, began to reconsider what they thought they knew about us. A species considered too weak, too young, too disorganized to matter had not only survived a coordinated betrayal from within the highest levels of one of the galaxy's most powerful empires, but had provided the strategy that ended it. Humanity was no longer simply tolerated. Humanity had become something worth watching. I did not feel like a hero standing in that smoking courtyard. I felt exhausted and grieved for Asire, who had just watched her own brother's ambition nearly cost her everything. But I understood, even then, that the events of that night had changed something far larger than the fate of one palace or one royal family. The galaxy had just learned that the marriage forced upon a soldier and a princess to buy a few years of peace had produced something neither side had planned for. It had produced a partnership capable of surviving anything thrown against it. Neither of us yet understood how soon that partnership would be tested on a scale far greater than a single night of betrayal, or how the shadow Kaelor had dismissed as a mere tool would soon reveal itself to be the true threat neither empire nor alliance had ever truly been prepared to face. 6 years after the wedding, I stood in a council chamber built for beings who did not sleep, did not tire, and did not forgive weakness, and I watched representatives from 4 different star systems ask, one after another, for the same thing. They wanted an alliance with Earth. It was a strange thing to witness, after everything that had come before. I remembered arriving in this galaxy as a symbol of humanity's weakness, a soldier handed over in marriage because my own government believed we had nothing else of value to offer. Now delegates from empires that had never bothered sending a single envoy to Earth were requesting formal meetings, citing the events at the Veil capital as proof that humanity possessed something their own cultures lacked. Isire sat beside me during those meetings, no longer simply my wife in the eyes of the Dominion, but my equal in matters of state. The title of consort regent had, over the years, become something closer to truth than formality. I sat in on council sessions not as a guest, but as a voice the other nobles had learned to listen to, sometimes reluctantly, but always seriously. The changes reached far beyond the palace walls. Human diplomats who had once been kept waiting for hours as a deliberate insult were now greeted with genuine respect in courts across the region. Human engineers, once dismissed as primitive by species with technology centuries ahead of our own, were being invited to consult on projects because our approach to problem-solving, shaped by scarcity and desperation, produced solutions that the wealthier empires had simply never needed to consider. Human soldiers serving in joint defense forces earned a reputation among allied species for a kind of stubborn resilience that even the proudest Veil commanders had come to respect after the battle in the capital. Nathan, who had stood beside me since the earliest days of the marriage, was eventually given command of a joint task force made up of human and Veil soldiers, the first formal military unit in the Dominion's long history to place a human in direct authority over Veil troops. He told me once, half joking, that he had gone from being an aide assigned to babysit a nervous soldier turned husband to commanding an army that other species now specifically requested for difficult missions. Our family grew during those years as well, and in ways neither of us had expected when the marriage began. Our first child, a daughter we named Elira, was born with features that belonged fully to neither species, pale violet eyes like her mother, but a stubbornness and warmth that reminded everyone who met her of her father. Our second child, a son we named Corin, grew quickly into a curious, restless boy who split his time between studying ancient Veil history with his grandfather and asking endless questions about Earth, a planet he had never seen but spoke of with a kind of quiet longing that reminded me how far from home I still was, even after all these years. Watching our children grow up, caught between two worlds, taught me something I had not expected to learn from a marriage that began as nothing more than a political necessity. The blending of two very different peoples was not a weakness to be managed. It was becoming, slowly and quietly, a strength neither empire could claim entirely on its own. Not everyone welcomed that strength. As humanity's reputation grew, so did resentment from those who saw our rise as a threat, rather than an opportunity. Some of it came from within the Dominion itself. Older nobles who had never forgiven Isire for elevating a human to a position of real power, who whispered that Kalor's ambitions, however poorly executed, had not been entirely wrong about the dangers of bending tradition to accommodate outsiders. Kalor himself remained imprisoned, stripped of his titles, a quiet reminder of what unchecked resentment could lead to, but his ideas did not die with his downfall. They simply moved underground, finding new voices among those who feared what humanity's rise might eventually cost the old powers of the galaxy. Further resentment came from beyond the Dominion's borders entirely, from rival empires who had spent generations building their own reputations for strength and dominance, only to watch a species they had never bothered to notice suddenly become a name spoken with respect across dozens of star systems. Isire's advisors began receiving reports of quiet meetings between several of these rival powers, discussions about how to contain humanity's growing influence before it spread further, discussions that stopped short of open hostility but carried an unmistakable undertone of threat. I remember a particular evening, sitting with Isire in the private study that had once been her father's, reviewing reports of these growing tensions late into the night. She looked tired, in a way I rarely saw from her, the weight of holding together an empire that was changing faster than many of its people were prepared to accept. "They fear what they cannot control," she said, staring at a report detailing yet another rival power's objections to an upcoming joint defense treaty between Earth and the Dominion. "Humanity does not fit into the categories my people have always used to understand strength. You do not conquer for glory. You do not measure worth by bloodline. And that unpredictability terrifies empires who have built their entire identity around rigid order." I told her that I understood the fear better than she might expect, because humanity had spent its own history being afraid of things it did not understand, and fear like that rarely led anywhere good unless someone was willing to build a bridge instead of a wall. She looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly that she believed, more than anything else in her long life, that the bridge we had built together, however unwillingly it had begun, might be the only thing capable of holding the wider galaxy together when the true crisis finally arrived. Neither of us yet knew how soon that crisis would come, or how directly it would test everything we had built. The rumors of the shadow beyond the outer territories, the ones Kalor had once dismissed as a tool to be used and discarded, had grown too large and too frequent to ignore any longer. Entire settlements along the far borders of Allied space had gone silent, their last transmissions describing something that consumed rather than conquered, that left no survivors and no wreckage behind, only empty space where thriving colonies had once stood. Scout ships sent to investigate simply stopped responding, their final coordinates marking the edge of a growing darkness that seemed to expand a little further with each passing season. The Dominion scholars had a name for it now, spoken rarely and never lightly. They called it the Hollow, an ancient intelligence, neither fully organic nor fully mechanical, that had apparently slept for millennia in the deep unclaimed space beyond even the oldest empire's maps, and had recently begun to wake. I raised the matter formally in council for the first time during a joint session that included representatives from the newly allied human colonies, Vale commanders, and delegates from two of the smaller neighboring species who had also begun forming closer ties with both Earth and the Dominion since the events at the capital. The response was exactly what I had come to expect from a galaxy full of proud, independent powers who had never learned to trust one another enough to face a shared threat together. Denial from some, dismissal from others. A few, particularly among the rival empires still resentful of humanity's rise, suggested privately that the Hollow, whatever it truly was, might solve their concerns about human influence far more efficiently than open conflict ever could, an idea so coldly cynical that even some of the Dominion's own hardened nobles seemed uncomfortable hearing it spoken aloud. Isire did not share that cynicism. She had grown up hearing the old stories about the Hollow, dismissed as myth by scholars who preferred comfortable ignorance to uncomfortable preparation, and she had learned, through years, standing beside a husband who refused to underestimate any threat, that old fears sometimes carried old truths worth taking seriously. Together, we began quietly building something the wider galaxy had never seen before, an informal network of cooperation between species who normally would never have trusted one another enough to share resources or intelligence. It began small joint patrols along the border regions closest to the growing darkness, shared data between human, Vael, and allied scientists trying to understand exactly what the Hollow was and how it moved. It was not a formal alliance in the way the Dominion understood such things, built on treaties and bloodlines and centuries of tradition. It was something newer, messier, built on the same stubborn cooperation that had first brought a human soldier and a Vael princess together against their will, and had slowly, unexpectedly, turned into genuine partnership. Word of this growing cooperation reached the rival empires who resented humanity's rise, and their concern deepened rather than eased. A galaxy where old powers cooperated openly with a young, unpredictable species like humanity was a galaxy where the old rules of dominance through fear and bloodline no longer guaranteed control. Several of those empires began, quietly at first and then with growing boldness, to actively work against the network Isire and I had built, withholding intelligence, spreading doubt among smaller allied species, occasionally sabotaging joint operations meant to track the Hollow's movements. I remember standing on a balcony overlooking the capital one evening, watching the city lights stretch toward the horizon, thinking about how much had changed since the night of my wedding, when I had been nothing more than a symbol handed over to buy a few years of uncertain peace. Isire joined me there, our daughter Elira asleep in her arms, our son Corin, already old enough to be arguing enthusiastically with his tutors about ancient battle strategies in the room behind us. "We built something no one expected," she said quietly, watching the lights of the city she would one day rule alone. I told her that we were not finished building it yet, because whatever the Hollow truly was, whatever the rival empires were planning in their quiet, resentful meetings, the wider galaxy was about to learn that the marriage forged to buy a few years of peace had produced something far more dangerous to old, rigid systems of power than either of us could have imagined on that first violent night. It had produced hope, stubborn and unpredictable, spreading star system by star system, exactly the kind of thing that empires built on fear and bloodline had never learned how to stop. What none of us yet understood, standing on that balcony under a sky slowly filling with the light of distant, uncertain stars, was that the darkness gathering beyond the borders was not simply waiting any longer. It was already moving toward us, faster than anyone had prepared for, and it would soon force every power in the galaxy, willing or not, to choose a side in a war none of them were ready to fight. The border colony of Estoril went dark on a morning that began like any other, and by the time the first distress signal finally broke through the static, there was almost nothing left to save. I was in the war room within minutes of the alert reaching the palace, Isire already ahead of me, studying a tactical display where an entire star system's worth of settlements had simply stopped transmitting all at once. Nathan arrived shortly after, commanding officer now of the joint human and Vael defense fleet, his expression grim in a way I had rarely seen from him even during the worst of the earlier crises. The Hollow was no longer a rumor whispered in old scholars' texts. It had reached the edge of Allied space, and it had done so faster and with far greater coordination than anyone believed something so ancient could possess. The scout reports that trickled in over the following hours painted a picture more terrifying than anything the old stories had described. It was not a fleet in any conventional sense, not ships built by hands or minds that thought the way organic beings thought. It moved as something closer to a living tide, vast constructs of dark, shifting material that consumed everything in their path: technology, biology, even the raw materials of shattered worlds, and grew larger and more coordinated with everything it absorbed. Every world it touched went silent within hours. Every fleet sent to intercept it simply vanished from sensors, swallowed into whatever incomprehensible process drove the thing forward. and it was moving directly toward the heart of Allied space, toward systems that held both human colonies and the ancestral worlds of the Dominion itself. The council that gathered in the following days was unlike anything the galaxy had seen in living memory. Representatives from rival empires, who had spent years quietly working against the network Isire and I had built, now sat across the same table as human diplomats and Veil commanders, forced by simple, brutal necessity to consider cooperation they had resisted for years. Even the delegates who had once suggested privately that the Hollow might solve their concerns about humanity's rise now understood, with the particular clarity that only genuine terror provides, that the thing consuming worlds along the border made no distinction at all between species it considered old or young, strong or weak, worthy or unworthy. It simply consumed. I stood before that fractured, frightened council and made the argument that Isire and I had been building toward for years without either of us fully realizing it. I told them that the old ways, empires standing alone, measuring strength through bloodline and conquest and rigid tradition, had already failed to stop what was coming. Scout ships built on centuries of proud engineering had vanished without a trace. Fleets built on generations of disciplined military doctrine had been consumed within hours. Whatever the Hollow was, it did not respect the old rules any of these empires had built their power upon. What it could not account for, I argued, was the same thing it had never had to face before: a galaxy of different, stubborn, unpredictable peoples, choosing, for the first time in recorded memory, to fight together instead of alone. It was Isire who spoke next, and I watched something shift across that fractured council as she did. The same authority that had once silenced a noble's cruel joke at a dinner table, now commanding the attention of representatives from a dozen different star systems. She spoke of her own brother's failure, of an ambition built on the belief that strength meant standing apart from those considered lesser, and how that belief had nearly destroyed everything he claimed to want to protect. She spoke of a marriage forced upon her and a human soldier years earlier, one she had resented with everything in her at the time, and how that same marriage had taught her more about true strength than centuries of Dominion tradition ever had. Strength, she told the council, was not the absence of difference. It was the willingness to stand beside difference when everything depended on it. The vote that followed was not unanimous, and it was not without bitterness from empires who still resented the shift in power that cooperation represented. But for the first time in the galaxy's long, fractured history, a true alliance formed across species who had spent generations distrusting one another, united not by shared blood or shared tradition, but by the shared understanding that none of them would survive what was coming alone. The battle for Esteril's outer system began 3 days later, and I will remember every hour of it for the rest of my life. Nathan commanded the combined fleet from the forward line, human and Val ships flying in formations that blended the discipline of Dominion tactics with the flexible, adaptive strategies humanity had learned across our own long history of survival. Delegates from the smaller allied species contributed technology and intelligence that neither humans nor the Veil possessed alone. Sensor arrays capable of tracking the Hollow's shifting mass in ways our own instruments could not manage independently. Isire and I remained at the command center on the nearest fortified world, coordinating the defense alongside representatives from every allied power, and for the first time in that long, difficult war council, I watched species who had spent years distrusting one another share information freely, adjust strategies in real time based on suggestions from officers they would never have listened to a decade earlier. The Hollow struck with a force that nearly broke that fragile alliance within the first hour, its consuming mass tearing through the outer defensive line with a speed that left even our most optimistic projections looking naive. Ships were lost, both human and Veil, and for a long, terrible stretch of time, it seemed the old stories had been right all along, that nothing built by mortal hands could stand against something so ancient and so hungry. It was a desperate, unconventional strategy, born from the same stubborn human instinct that had saved lives in a mountain ambush years earlier and turned the tide of a coup in a hidden service tunnel, that finally gave us an opening. Rather than meeting the Hollow's advance with concentrated firepower, the way every failed fleet before us had attempted, I proposed scattering our forces into a shifting, unpredictable pattern, designed not to destroy the hollow directly, but to redirect its consuming instinct toward carefully placed decoys built from salvaged, non-essential material, drawing its attention away from the fortified worlds behind our lines, while Allied scientists worked desperately to complete a weapon theorized from data gathered across weeks of careful, cooperative research, a weapon no single empire could have developed alone. Isire approved the plan without hesitation, translating the strategy into commands that Veil forces, still uncomfortable with such unconventional tactics, ultimately trusted because they trusted her, and because years of standing beside a human husband had taught her that survival sometimes required abandoning pride entirely. The weapon, when it was finally ready, did not destroy the hollow outright. Nothing built in those desperate weeks could have accomplished something so absolute against an intelligence that ancient. What it did instead was fracture the hollow's coordination, severing whatever unseen process allowed its scattered mass to move and consume as a single, unified force. Without that coordination, the hollow's advance collapsed into chaotic, disconnected fragments, vulnerable in a way it had never been before, and the combined fleet, exhausted but still standing, finally drove the remnants back beyond the border it had crossed only weeks earlier. It was not a complete victory. Scholars and scientists across every Allied world agreed that something as ancient and vast as the Hollow could not be fully destroyed by weapons built in a matter of weeks, and that its remnants, scattered and wounded, would likely require generations of continued vigilance to fully understand and contain. But it was a victory nonetheless, the first true defeat the Hollow had suffered in all the long, silent years it had spent consuming worlds along the galaxy's forgotten edges. And it was a victory that no single empire, however proud or powerful, could claim as entirely its own. In the months that followed, the Galactic Council that had formed in desperation during those darkest days chose not to dissolve back into the old, fractured system of isolated empires once the immediate crisis had passed. Instead, delegates from every species that had fought together at Estoril voted to formalize the cooperation that necessity had first forced upon them, creating something the galaxy had never truly possessed before, a lasting alliance built not on conquest or bloodline, but on the hard-earned trust between species who had bled together to survive a shared threat. Humanity was granted a permanent seat on that new council, not as a client species tolerated for its usefulness, but as a founding power whose strategies and resilience had helped save countless worlds beyond its own. Our reputation, once dismissed entirely by empires who had never bothered to notice us, now stood as proof, across dozens of star systems, that strength came in forms far stranger and more valuable than the old rules of bloodline and conquest had ever accounted for. I stood beside Isire during the final ceremony marking the formation of that new council, our daughter Elira now old enough to stand proudly at her mother's side, our son Corin already talking eagerly about joining the joint defense forces his father and Nathan had helped build from nothing. I thought back, standing in that grand new chamber built specifically to house representatives from a dozen different species who had once refused to sit at the same table, to the frightened, resentful young man who had stood at his own wedding years earlier, forced into a marriage neither he nor his bride had wanted, surrounded by nobles who called him nothing more than a human pet. Isire reached for my hand during a quiet moment in that ceremony, the same steady, cool grip I remembered from the night an assassin's blade had nearly ended everything before it began. "Do you remember," she asked quietly, "what I called you on our wedding day?" I told her I remembered every word. She smiled, something rare and genuine that few beyond our own family ever saw from her, and told me that she had been right that day, more right than she had ever imagined at the time, though the word she had chosen carried far more meaning now than either of us could have understood standing in that glass hall years earlier. "Useful was never the right word for what you became," she said. "What you became was necessary, not just to me and not just to the Dominion, but to every world that still exists, because two frightened, unwilling strangers chose, somewhere along the way, to stand beside each other instead of simply enduring a fate neither of us had chosen. I looked out across that new council chamber, filled with representatives from species who had spent generations distrusting one another, now united by a peace built from shared sacrifice rather than shared blood, and I understood, more clearly than I had ever understood anything in my life, exactly how far a single unwanted marriage had carried us. A wedding meant only to buy a few uncertain years of peace between one struggling species and one proud, ancient empire had, in the end, rewritten the balance of power across an entire galaxy. And somewhere far beyond that grand new chamber, in the vast, patient dark between the stars, whatever remained of an ancient hunger that had once seemed unstoppable now understood, for the first time in its long, silent existence, that it had finally met something it could not simply consume. It had met a partnership stronger than any empire it had ever devoured. Years later, when our children asked how it had all begun, I would tell them the truth, that it began not with courage or destiny or grand design, but with a frightened soldier and a resentful princess, forced together by circumstance, who chose, one small stubborn moment at a time, to build something neither of them believed possible on the day they were first unwillingly wed.